Welcome to the 700 Club, the dangers of social media. Parents across the country have been worried about the impact it's having on their children, and Congress is considering national regulations.
The concerns come from both sides of the aisle. So what could a possible bill look like? Brody Carter brings us the story.
4 senators, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, telling the Associated Press they represent millions of American parents who believe social media companies have too much negative influence on teens and younger kids. So they've written a simple, straightforward measure that's easy to understand.
Normally you see a bill come out of D.C. that is sometimes thousands of pages long. This one's 8.
The bill has 3 key points. Kids under 13 would be banned from social media. Children 13 through 17 would need a parent or guardian's consent to create an account. And it would forbid social media companies from using algorithms to recommend content for users under 18.
And I think people appreciate the simplicity. If a parent can't understand the bill, it's hard for them to rally behind it.
Senator Chris Murphy has seen both the positives and negatives of social media.
Sometimes the silly and entertaining content that they get on those sites brings joy to their life. But I've also seen the tremendous downside. I've seen how some of their friends who are in trouble get very quickly spun into deep, dark corners of the internet.
Senator Brian Schatz says the growing evidence is clear. Social media is making kids more depressed and wreaking havoc on their mental health. The National Institutes of Health found children under 18 are susceptible to social media health-related problems, including depression, eating disorders, and anxiety. The CDC shows 60% of girls using social media report feeling persistent sadness or hopelessness, with 30% seriously considering suicide. The senator's bill is one of several measures being proposed in Washington, calling for stricter regulations on social media companies. Senator Tom Cotton says their bill puts parents back in control of what their kids experience online.
I've had so many people reach out to me and say, thank you for proposing a solution, for helping me get back my responsibility, my rights as a parent in the digital world that I have in the real world.
The senators know there will be pushback from tech companies, and any legislation proposing to regulate big tech and social media will face major challenges in Congress itself, including disagreements about overregulation and questions about civil liberties. So it remains to be seen if any bill can successfully move through both the House and Senate. Brody Carter, CBN News.
I just have to say it's about time. I wish Congress would do even more when you consider that China has more protections for its citizens on their right to privacy, what is done with their image, with their history, their browser history, all of these things, that China actually has more protection than we do here in the United States. Europe took the lead with it years ago. We have never followed because we have this divided government that wants to play politics with everything. It's time for us to demand from our representatives, please protect our children. Please protect us from all of these new dangers that are coming in the internet. And when you consider AI having free access to everything about you, it can get very chilling. In other news, a new chapter will begin in the United Kingdom tomorrow with the coronation of King Charles III. And as the head of the Church of England, he has the title Defender of the Faith. Still, he's made clear he sees his role as defender of all faiths, not just Christianity. CBN's Jenna Browder has that story.
It's one of the biggest royal events of our time, the coronation of King Charles III. And while Buckingham Palace is keeping quiet on most of the details, we are hearing a few things. It's been 70 years since the last coronation. Just like Queen Elizabeth's in 1953, this will be at London's Westminster Abbey and keep mostly with tradition.
It is, of course, primarily a religious service. There's no constitutional need for the coronation. Charles became king as soon as his mother died back in September.
King Charles, though, is expected to add his own touches, which include some new religious aspects.
It's very significant indeed. The last coronation of the late Queen in 1953 was almost entirely run by Anglican clergy. The male clergy of the Church of England.
Ian Bradley with the University of St. Andrews School of Divinity tells CBN News more Christian denominations will be included this time. And for the first time, Charles will include other faiths as well.
So one of the things that's happened recently is that the order of service was delayed. And we're pretty sure it was delayed because Charles wanted a group of representatives of other faiths to lead the prayers. But there's a rule in the Church of England, it's part of the Church's law, and it's backed up by Parliament's law, that to lead the liturgy in an Anglican church, you have to be a believing Anglican. So there was a conflict, and it looks like Charles lost.
Now, instead of leading prayers, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Jewish leaders will present the king with 4 pieces of coronation regalia. Gavin Ashington once served as chaplain to the late Queen.
Can you tell us about her faith and how she viewed her role and how that might compare to King Charles?
Faith was very important to her, and we know this from her Christmas broadcasts. They increasingly were personal and very faithful, and although she was advised, she would have written them essentially herself.
He says no one's quite sure about King Charles's private beliefs.
Well, we've had one Christian Christmas broadcast, but he was brought up under the influence of Carl Gustav Jung. A man called Lawrence van der Post was his tutor. So he's much more committed to a more progressive agenda than Christianity is comfortable with. And I think one of the tensions we're going to see both in the coronation service and in his reign is the way in which he tries to balance his Christianity, being defender of the Protestant faith, with his sense that he needs to reflect a secular, progressive worldview that his subjects have adopted or are part of.
But Ashington says not knowing the monarch's personal beliefs is not necessarily a bad thing.
If you have a king or a queen, you don't necessarily want to know what their private views are, because they may then only represent one half of their kingdom instead of the other. It becomes polarizing, like politics.
Thousands are expected to line the streets Saturday morning as King Charles and his wife, Queen Consort Camilla, make their way from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey. The ceremony starts at 11 a.m. local time. That's 6 a.m. East Coast time. Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Well, you go back to the history of how did we get this title, Defender of the Faith. It's not unique to England. It was curious how that commentator said Defender of the Protestant faith, because the Church of England split from the Church in Rome, from the Catholic Church, and they created their own national religion. And for centuries, the only people who could ordain or crown a new king were Anglican ministers. You weren't allowed to be other Protestants. You could only be Anglican and do that. But the history goes all the way back to Charlemagne. And it was designed, it was the title, Defender of the Faith. I will defend the faith against the Muslims. He came to power after the Battle of Tours, which followed the sack of Burgundy. And it was all Muslim invasions coming out of Africa. They first took Spain, and then they tried to take all of Europe. And so Charlemagne said no, and he created the Roman Empire. And with that, he established himself as king, and I am now the defender of the faith. So as we see these things change over time, I think it's wonderful that Prince Charles, now King Charles, is going to say, I'm open to other Protestant faiths. But when you say, I want to be a defender of all faiths, well, is that taking it a road too far? We'll see. Sometimes the chair you sit in makes who you are. And my hope is, becoming king, he'll get a revelation.